Welcome to the third in our series of programs on the history of the Ukrainian people. My name is Roman Onufrijchuk, and today I'm going to try to leap from the middle of the 17th century right across and to the first few years of our current century, so about 300 years. And that 300 years, along the Dnieper River, like that, Ukraine will be divided. This portion will end up in Polish hands for a while and then go into the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The other side of the river, this will be ruled by the Cossacks. It's called the Hetmanate. It'll be ruled by them until about, the beginning of the 1800s. In any event, Khmelnytsky dies 1657. That year, the Cossacks begin to fight each other. It's an internal struggle, and it's a very bloody one. Ultimately, it ends up costing the Ukrainian Cossacks 50,000 men that they lose fighting each other. The Russians invade in 1659. They are defeated, but the Hetman, the elected Hetman Vyhovsky, doesn't take advantage of the situation. And what ultimately happens is that Ukraine splits into two Cossack armies. And this is the period of Ukrainian history that Ukrainian historians call the Ruin, or Ruina. Why it's called the Ruina is because there are two hetmans, a hetman in the east, a hetman in the west, and for a period of approximately 200 years, there are extremely strained relationships, quite often breaking out into actual conflicts. The elected hetman and the elected rulers are quite often deposed. A lot of internal politics goes on, and this is a textbook example of what is called divide and conquer. So the Ukrainian people are divided, effectively conquered. The most important figure to emerge from this is a figure by the name of Ivan Mazepa. Now, Mazepa is a very interesting figure. He's very well known in world literature. A number of people have written about him. There are a lot of romantic legends and myths about Mazepa. But we know this about him for sure, that he was probably one of the best educated men of his day. He was elected hetman in the what we call the left bank of Ukraine, in other words, the eastern part, this part of the hetmanate. He was elected as hetman in the year 1687, and he remained in that post for 21 years, which is no small achievement. Incidentally, his period at the helm, if you will, was a period marked by increasing tension within both sides of the Ukrainian Cossack army. And the tension became a class-based tension. The starshina, or the officers, were the privileged group, and then there were what was called the holota, the poor Cossacks. So you have an internal social tension, and you have a tension between the two Cossack groups. Now, Mazepa favored the starshina. He was a very well-educated man, a great patron of the arts, a great supporter of learning. While he was in charge, new churches were built, monasteries were built, schools were improved. The Kiev Mahila Academy was turned into an actual, very serious school of education. He made very many great contributions to the overall growth of Ukrainian civilization during the period. Now, his nemesis, for what began as his great friend, but who had become his nemesis, was Peter I of Russia, otherwise known as Peter the Great. Mazepa was very much, if one can imagine this, he was a mentor to Peter in the sense that Peter, as a young man, didn't know much about the Poles. Mazepa knew them well. Mazepa knew the Crimean Tatars very well. He knew the Ottoman Empire very well. And he was a man who Peter enjoyed having in his presence. What Peter didn't know was that Mazepa was very slowly and very methodically planning a revolution. And Mazepa's dream was to reunite what Khmelnytsky had originally done, in other words, to reconnect both parts of Ukraine with himself as hetman. Now, as Peter, we all know that Peter was a man who modernized Russia. As Peter began to modernize Russia, especially as he began to modernize the army, he started assigning Germans and Russian officers, German officers and Russian officers, to Cossack contingents. And what has been happening is that the original Pereyaslav agreement has been lost. So there's no clear idea of what was originally agreed between Khmelnytsky and the Tsar. So every couple of years this gets renegotiated, and every time it gets renegotiated, more and more and more privileges of the Cossacks are removed. Now, by the time that Peter's modernizing the army, assigning non-Ukrainian officers to Ukrainian units, These non-Ukrainian officers really thought that these soldiers were peasants and basically used them as cannon fodder in the various campaigns that Peter conducted. So very, very quietly, Mazepa plans to go to war with Peter. And he needs somebody to join him for this. And who does he turn to? A man who was called the bully of Europe at the time. He was a young punk who probably would have done better if he stayed home. And that was Charles XII of Sweden, who had already really distinguished himself in a number of brawls in Europe and was looking for a partner to go after Peter. So they agreed to fight Peter. The Zaporozhians, who were down here, the Cossacks, agreed to join Mazepa, but the peasants did not. Peasants didn't trust him because he was more oriented toward the officer class. So, the battle was fought in Poltava in 1709, probably one of those great battles of history, Poltava being located right there. And in 1709, this was in June that this battle was fought, this was the last time that Ukrainians tried to use military power to free themselves from the Russians. Once the battle was over, Mazepa fled. He fled down into what is today Moldavia, and he died here the same year of the battle in 1709. His his colleagues went with him to Moldavia, and they became the first Ukrainian immigration or immigrant community as such. With the death of Mazepa, the integration of Ukraine into the Russian Empire increased apace. Centralization of functions, increasing control particularly over the Hetmanate, over this area that was governed by the Cossacks themselves. For a long time, no Hetman was allowed. Peter the Great insisted that any Zaporozhian caught be put to death immediately, and increasing control of this area. The upshot was that in the western part of Ukraine, Polish nobility again returned and took over their possessions in terms of villages and people. Hetman was forbidden in eastern Ukraine, and in his place, something called the Little Russian College was assigned. And this was made up of 6 Russians who basically decided how the Hetmanate would run. In 1724, to give you an idea of how this centralization was affecting the countryside, one of the Russian administrators boasted that taxes in 1724 in the Hetmanate had gone up by 600%. It's a pretty amazing thought. So they were squeezing the people pretty hard. At this time, about 20,000 Cossacks existed in the Hetmanate, and probably an equivalent number of the Free Cossacks down in Zaporizhia, by the Sich, the fortress Sich on the Dnipro River. In the 1700s, around the middle of the 1700s, while the Russian yoke increasingly compressed or oppressed the people, in this area of Ukraine, there were rebellions around 1750 that involved up to 120,000 peasants at various times. So somebody once said of Ukraine, it's an easy place to conquer, but almost an impossible place to rule or govern. And where the Poles had learned that, the Russians were in the process of learning that as well. Again, the middle of the 1700s, another set of interesting developments historically here in the Carpathian Mountains. Here, a movement called the Opryshki comes into being. These are very similar to the Cossacks, except they function in the mountains. And they had a very colorful leader, a man called Oleksa Dobush, who was sort of the equivalent of the Cossacks, except trying to protect Ukrainian peasants from the nobility, from the Hungarian nobility who ruled this area at the time. By the middle of the 1700s, 1750, Elizabeth came to the throne in Ukraine, or rather in Russia. She was the empress of then Russia. And it just so happened that her husband was a Ukrainian. He had been a singer in the royal court. Incidentally, one of the oldest music schools in Ukraine is in this area, and it was opened in the mid-1600s. Ukrainians had that special rhythm or something. And quite often, the imperial choirs, the choirs in imperial cathedrals were made up almost exclusively of Ukrainians. And Ukrainian composers did a great deal of music for the church. And just so happens there was a young, handsome tenor singer, and Elizabeth met him and fell in love with him, and they were married. And he, through her, managed to convince her that the Cossacks should have a hetman again. And so in 1760, his younger brother, Kirill Rozumowski, was elected the last hetman of the Cossacks. And I managed to make a trip into this area. He was elected and made hetman up here in Khlukiv. It's a small community today, but it has some very remarkable architectural remains, churches and such like. Well, as long as Elizabeth sat on the throne of Imperial Russia, things weren't too bad in Ukraine. But in 1762, Catherine the Great came to the throne. And there are many Ukrainian folk songs about Catherine, most of which I don't think I could repeat on public television. The Ukrainian mind is very colorful sometimes, and the epitaphs that Ukrainians came up with for Catherine, a little bit on the X-rated side. She really imposed the rule of Russia on the Ukrainians. During or just before her rule, serfdom was brought in to Ukraine, so peasants became property again. But probably what she is best known for was that it was under her rule in 1775 that the Cossack fortress and the Cossack lands in these areas, the fortress itself was destroyed, and the lands themselves were handed over to immigrants, immigrants that she brought in, or invited rather, from Serbia and from Germany. So this area had large German colonies right up until the revolution, and still large German communities in the southern steppe. Now, how this all came about is as follows. Catherine wanted to make war on the Crimean Tatars, and she did make war on them in 1774. She used the Cossack army quite extensively, and in 1775, while the bulk of the Cossack force was on the front, the returning Russian army, besieged the fortress of the Sich and destroyed the fortress and effectively ended that chapter of Ukrainian history, the chapter of the Cossack experience. Though the traditions lived on in this area, and we'll see in the next program when we talk about the 20th century, how some of those Cossack traditions emerged in the anarchist movements that took place here in the southern steppe. The next date that's worth talking about, I mean, you know, doing this, to be honest, doing this kind of program, it's maddening because there's so much that can't be said, so one has to synoptically kind of bounce along. But I suppose the next significant date in Ukrainian history would be 1814, so we're leaping ahead. On that day, on that year rather, a man was born. His name was Taras Shevchenko. He was born the son of a serf. His mother died when he was still a child, so he was an orphan. And he was to become Ukraine's greatest poet. As a matter of fact, his poetry is probably, to this day, the most powerful account of what the Ukrainian experience had been up to that time. He was handed over by his father to a local deacon to be made literate. While he was studying, 5 years later, so he's a 5-year-old boy when the first Ukrainian grammar shows up, just as a note. By the time that he's in his teens, the Russians really impose an official policy of Russification in Ukraine. And by the time that he's 24 years old, that would have made it 1838. The date was April 22nd. He was studying in St. Petersburg. He was drawing in a park. And a noted artist of the day happened to walk by, see his drawings, asked him who he was, and found out that he'd been sent to St. Petersburg by his owner to learn how to be an artist. And he was a very gifted young man. And it was on the 22nd of April in 1838 when a group of friends bought Shevchenko his freedom. They bought him from his owner, and he entered the St. Petersburg Academy of Fine Art. He became involved in a movement called the Movement of St. Cyril and Methodius. This was revealed to the government. He, meanwhile, was writing poems, and in a poem called The Dream, he described the Tsar in very unflattering language. The Tsar's wife he was even more unflattering about. And once he was shown to be a member of this organization, he was arrested and sent into forced conscription and exile with a note on his arrest warrant written by the Tsar himself that said, "This man is forbidden to draw, paint, or write." And so Shevchenko went off, served time in the Kos Aral by the Caspian Sea. Right around this time, again, uprisings of peasants around 1857, again, up to 120,000 people involved in some of these uprisings. By the 1860s, the Ukrainian intelligentsia, which incidentally, the two groups that are most often terrorized were the intelligentsia and the peasants. But the intelligentsia began organizing what were called hromady. Now, hromada is a community. And these communities, Ukrainian intellectual communities, began to spread throughout Ukraine. Now, one thing that should be noted, throughout this period, most of the cities in Ukraine were not inhabited by Ukrainians. The Ukrainians were mainly in the countryside. They were the people who were working and providing the food. The cities, or administrative centers, were mainly places where foreigners lived, foreign administrators. And it's during the 1800s, into the 1900s, that Ukrainian cities become increasingly Ukrainian in terms of their population. Well, serfdom was an extremely tough road to hoe. Serfdom meant that you weren't your own property. You didn't get to decide what you did in the morning. You didn't get to decide what you got to do all day. You worked for the lord who owned you. You married when you were given permission. You left the village if you were given permission. You did nothing without permission. And finally, in the process of liberalization that was going on in the world, and we're thinking now of Austro-Hungary and the Russian Empire, in 1861, the Russian Empire canceled serfdom. And what's interesting is that that happened exactly 1 month after Taras Shevchenko died. He had lived to the age of 46. His health had been totally destroyed in exile. And for the 46 years that he'd been on this planet, he had lived 1/4 of his life as a free man. 3/4 of his life he was either a prisoner or a serf. Well, incidentally, what had happened in Western Ukraine was that Poland had been partitioned, and Western Ukraine, specifically here I mean Galicia and Bukovina, these two provinces, ended up as part of a larger province that involved Poland, and it was called Galicia, and it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is why a lot of Ukrainians who immigrated here in the 1890s, quite often in their documents, it lists them as Austrian nationals, because they came from a portion of what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And by 1863, which is 2 years after Shevchenko's death, the official Russification policy was such that no literature was allowed to be produced in the Ukrainian language. This was the famous Valuyev. Valuyev was a minister of education, Count Pyotr Valuyev, who said there has never been, nor is there now, nor will there ever be a Ukrainian language. And with that stroke, he dismissed the existence of I don't know how many million people, contending that the language didn't exist. He therefore forbid writing any books in it, which is, I suppose, a pretty handy way of making sure language doesn't exist. So nothing but religious texts could be done in Ukrainian. Almost a little less than a decade later, 1867, in the Ems Ukaz, which is the Ems Decree, the Tsar signed it at a place called Ems in Germany. This Ukaz made it against the law to teach in the Ukrainian language, and all Ukrainian language books had to be removed from schools and destroyed. So official Russification was well underway and was certainly part of the agenda. What is interesting, however, is that while 1876 to 1905 was such a difficult time for the intelligentsia, such a difficult time for the peasants, Ukrainian literature, art, music flourished, as did scholarship. Quite often books couldn't be published in Eastern Ukraine, so they'd be published in Lviv, in Western Ukraine, where under the Austrian government things were a little bit more humane. Ukrainians were elected to the Austrian parliament, and generally the cultural life in Western Ukraine, as opposed to Eastern Ukraine, was far, far more conducive. However, maybe in spite, perhaps in spite of the pressure that was being applied to the Ukrainians in the eastern part of Ukraine, the arts, the letters, as I say, scholarship flourished. even though Ukraine found herself divided in half, and even though there wasn't much of an opportunity to be involved in political life, even though there was an official policy of Russification, the Ukrainians began within that century, within the 1800s, to very actively pursue an idea, and that idea was the idea of statehood. Among the first people, among the first sort of nation builders or builders of national consciousness were historians, various historians who wrote various histories of the events of 1648, of other Cossack uprisings, and Cossacks became, in a sense, they became the crystallization of a dream. Here were people who had taken their lives into their own hands and out of commitment to their families who lived elsewhere in Ukraine, had dedicated themselves to being, again, an idiom or an expression that comes from the time of Kievan Rusiet, talking about the chests of men being the walls between the people and the various groups that lived in the steppe and continued to raid into Ukraine. While the Cossack thing ended in 1775, by the early 1800s, it came back to life in the most amazing manner in a long poem called the Aeneid. And what this was a man by the name of Kotlяревsky, who was a retired government official who had retired to the Poltava area where the Cossacks had been defeated almost, a century earlier. In order to entertain his friends, he began doing a translation of Virgil's Aeneid, except the characters were not Greeks and Trojans, the characters were now Cossacks. And in the Aeneid, with its extremely succulent language and its command of color and idiom and its command of the Cossack epos and the Cossack way of life, Kotlяревsky basically immortalized their way of life in a robust and rich kind of way that remained as a basis in many ways for many writers who were to come, not least of which was Shevchenko. Now, the Cossack epos also is made up of something called dumy, and Duma is a thought. These were ballads that were sung by blind minstrels usually, which related stories about the Cossack way of life, related stories about the morality of that way of life, what was right and what was wrong, how a person ought to behave with respect to their family, to their colleagues, and so on. And these blind minstrels wandered Ukraine performing these songs and religious songs as well. And it's interesting that the name that one gives these blind minstrels is Kobzari, a singular word Kobzar. And Shevchenko's first collection of poetry is called Kobzar. To this day, the complete set of poems is referred to as Kobzar. And he is thought of as the great minstrel. And he was a great minstrel. The amazing thing about Shevchenko was that he wrote, certainly at any kind of international scale or world class, whatever terminology you want to use. But what he managed to do was he managed to take the Ukrainian folk song, the Cossack Duma, the folk song, and taking those harmonies, taking those rhythms, the internal rhymes, managed to build poetry that in fact spoke about the human condition, spoke about what was right, what was wrong, and so on. In fact, the moral dimension of Shevchenko's poetry is really quite powerful. But he was certainly not the only one at the time. We have others in Western Ukraine. Ivan Franko became extremely active, a poet. We still to this day do not have a complete edition of his full works. He wrote in German, he wrote in Ukrainian, he wrote in Polish. He was a poet, a playwright, less of a playwright, more of a poet, essayist, novelist, and also had a tremendous impact on the Ukrainian mind, also raised the language into literary form. Another sort of one of the big three during this period would have been a woman he himself was, he lived in Lviv in this area, whereas north in Volhynia there was Lesya Ukrainka. She was also a very powerful poet, And between the three of them, Ukrainka, Franco, and Shevchenko, you have sort of the first significant triad of Ukrainian literature that would provide the kind of impetus for continuing desires and demands and dreams and hopes and aspirations of someday again a united Ukraine, an independent Ukraine, because that's what Ukrainka and Franco and Shevchenko were writing about. And what was being carried there was that dream that Khmelnytsky had first seen, I suppose, when he rode into Kiev back in 49 rather, and been greeted as the Hetman of all Ukraine. So we'll talk about those aspirations and where those aspirations went when we get to the 20th century.